Hi everyone, I'm Suma and this is Andrew Hewson. He's a contemporary spiritual teacher based in North Carolina. Hi Andrew.
Hey Suma.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I spoke with David Buckland and that conversation has really opened up some more new questions. So I feel like this is a good time for us to do this interview.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, I'm glad that you and David had a chance to talk. So glad to be here.
By the way, I discovered you because of one of your students, Don Salmon. I think he attended one of your course.
Yeah. He's
he mentioned when I interviewed him, he mentioned you.
Okay, beautiful. Yeah.
Do you think it's okay to start with your story before the awakening and how that unfolded into your awakening? Maybe
Sure,
that would be good.
We can touch on that some. Yeah.
So please go ahead. How that unfolded.
Well, I suppose it's really just the story of the human condition. Maybe a more extreme case of that, but in early childhood, there was a deep sense of connection and a sense of spaciousness. At the time, I wasn't really able to articulate that, and there wasn't really a comparative reference point. So it was only when that seemed to subside and the sense of being the body and being so fragmented got very intense that there was that contrast and the ability to identify the way that it was before. So around the age of probably around 10 or 12, there was a deep sense of separation that started to come into the foreground of experience. And that was accompanied by just a heaviness and what was really an inability to feel connected to other human beings, no matter who it was. Even family members just felt very alien during that period. And so out of that sense of fragmentation, a seeking began, a seeking to try to find a different feeling, to try to feel more connected, more complete, and to compensate for that sense of lack that was really prominent. And that seeking showed up in different ways, watching lots of television, reading fantasy books, playing, pretend in the backyard. And then it translated into social settings where there would be a movement to try to feel a part of by being funny or just being whatever the environment seemed to call for. So it was almost, in a sense, a kind of chameleon-like way of being. There wasn't any real fixed identity other than that sense of fragmentation, and the dominance of the ego structure really didn't know who it was or what it was, and it seemed to be in this desperate existential crises, and so it would mimic whatever it perceived was needed in any given situation, according to the group or whoever it appeared to be around. And all of that really just didn't work. It would provide some temporary relief, but no real lasting freedom and comfort. And in the midst of that seeking, which, also expressed itself in eating lots of food and different eating habits that were unhealthy, things like that, alcohol was discovered. And when alcohol was consumed, it seemed that something was different because there appeared to be this substantial phenomena that could be consumed and would provide a different feeling value. And it wasn't an attempt to escape the different activities of human experience, but more of an attempt to try to find a way to be in the midst of those activities without feeling so separate, without feeling so fragmented. So a lot of times people may interpret addiction in whatever form as an attempt to escape, and I don't see it as that. It wasn't about escaping. It was about finding a way to be in the world that had some sense of belonging to it, And alcohol appeared to provide this sense of belonging initially. It was just this sense of sort of letting out a deep sigh, almost like a weight was lifted. And, Andrew didn't need to be anybody special. Andrew could be just be. And however that being showed up in any given situation felt okay. It felt natural. It felt appropriate. Now, that may not have been the case for those that were around, but in that altered condition, there was some false sense of security and some false sense of completion. But then again, it was fleeting. It didn't last. It had to be kept up. And that belief that this substance could provide some sense of fulfillment on a regular basis in a way that was manageable developed into we might say an obsession of sorts, an obsession which really consumed about a 10-year period of the lifetime here. And that evolved into, or devolved, however you want to look at it, into different drugs and just a desperation of attempting to discover some stable, lasting sense of belonging, sense of wholeness. So it's really not too different from what a lot of human beings go through, but it was just more of an exaggerated case and expressed itself in a little bit more of an extreme way, you might say. And there was all kinds of different behavioral patterning that was included in that. And around the age of 18 or so, there was a sense of kind of being trapped in this lifestyle. Like there was something that didn't want to live this way, and didn't want to continue in this way. And I would say, to some degree that had been there from the beginning. It was like almost this constant inner dichotomy, this constant inner conflict that was present. And although that sense of not wanting to continue was present, it just wasn't prevailing. It wasn't strong enough to provide any stable support for transformation at that point. So that sense of being trapped in a certain condition or status really characterized the period from about the age of 18 to 24. And there were lots of hospitalizations and lots of trips to the county jail. And doctors had pretty much given up hope, along with family members and friends to a large degree. And it was a pretty extreme case. A lot of addiction tends to be repetitive in its nature. And this was certainly the case here, but perhaps to a degree that was even unusual within that field. So by the time I was 24, I had been 15 times inpatient detox, 7 to 21 days at a time, 5 longer-term treatment centers, and other various hospitalizations, and so on and so forth. And was really just miserable and hopeless in this space of despair and despondency and not knowing or really caring what life was about. And at the age of 24, I left a treatment program, and 7 days later ended up relapsing and blacking out behind the wheel of a car, excuse me, behind the wheel of a car going about 45 miles per hour, and hit another car head on. And there were two other people involved, and all three of us ended up in the ICU on life support. And so after various surgeries and time in the hospital, I ended up in a medical isolation jail cell facing 30 years in prison. And in the jail cell, I was visited by a man who basically came and sat down beside me, and he told me that my issue wasn't alcohol, my issue wasn't drugs. The problem was that I was suffering from egocentricity. Yeah. And basically what he was saying was that separation was the issue, that my sense of separation and the dominance of that sense of separation was the issue. And he said it in his own way, but the message really penetrated into the heart in a way that it had never before. I had heard that there was intellectual understanding, all of those different things. But in this setting, something was different. You know, the karma just coalesced into a certain presentation that was optimal for this option of transmutation and transformation to arise. And so when he left the jail cell, I don't really have any memory of what happened, but when the memory sort of comes back online, things were profoundly different. There was unrecognizable presence that filled the jail cell. It is a presence that is like a field of light, yeah? And it almost looks like heat coming off the top of a grill, visually describing it, yet it's all pervasive, and it has an innately divine quality to it. So when this presence was recognized, of course, it was really recognizing itself. But at the time, there still seemed to be Andrew, you know, that was experiencing it. There was a deep sense of peace and a profound sense of well-being. And it was as if everything that preceded, seemed to precede that, made perfect sense. You know, there was this deep knowing that everything unfolded just the way that it needed to unfold, that nothing was out of place. And I know that it may be difficult for some listeners to understand that. You know, there's this idea, well, why did you, have to go through that or put other people through that or whatever? And really, there's no satisfactory intellectual explanation. It's something that has to be realized. And when we understand the nature of karma and we understand the nature of impressions, then things become a lot clearer. And I wasn't really privy to all of that at that point, but there was a knowing that everything was perfectly in place and that this was what needed to unfold in order for there to be this recognition of the divine presence in the way that it was shining forth. And at that point, it was like I was, in a way, I switched to a different kind of memory. So there was a remembering of different openings and different recognitions that had unfolded throughout the lifetime. And it really provided a beautiful context for what was unfolding and allowed for everything to make sense in a very deep and familiar way. An example would be there was, several points during childhood where I would be in the woods or somewhere with family exploring, and then all of a sudden the sense of there being a separate individual, Andrew, would just disappear. And it would be like there was just this emptiness looking out of the eyes, and there was just sense perception and just the naturalness of this open field of reality. And this would happen, periodically. And I could see how that related to the strong sense of separation and fragmentation, and how there was this, this conflict within the experience, because there was a tasting of the freedom of life, and at the same time there was this intense sense of bondage, which I now recognize to be really a gift of divine discontent, because that degree of being discontented with the human condition really is an opportunity that expressed itself as the blossoming of conscious awareness in this lifetime. And it was also a way to really taste, a broad spectrum of what life on earth is like, it has the potential to be like. So in that sense, it has provided a great deal of compassion and understanding. So one other, there were several other kind of what you might consider to be spiritual experiences, where there was just a shifting into a deeper recognition and understanding, and then it would seem to get lost and concealed, and the heaviness would come back, and the floundering about in that lifestyle would return, and it would only be remembered, just for a moment's clarity, and it would all make sense and then fade away. But this time, something was much different. It didn't leave, and from that point forward, the awareness of this field remained continuous to a certain degree. In the beginning, there seemed to be some fluctuation. And as I said, it still seemed that Andrew, was aware of the presence of God, was aware of the presence of this field of light all around. And it would show up almost in like a splotchy way. So, it was basically the replacement of what before appeared to be empty space. And, conscious awareness was revealing itself to itself. And so there would be just this recognition that the space was not empty, but it was full, and there was an aliveness. And there still seemed to be Andrew that was recognizing that, but it was like focusing in on itself. And as it would focus in on itself, it would intensify. And then that would just continue to grow on a daily basis. Another interesting phenomena that took place in that, what appears to be a transition period, and it's important for the viewers to understand that the awakening was not brought about by suffering. The shift is not brought about through things becoming too heavy. I hear that as an interpretation sometimes, and that certainly was not the case here. No shift in our identity is causally related to one incarnation. There's a whole spectrum of incarnations which translate into the karmic appearance of this body and this mind. And that is what expresses itself thusly. And that is really within the realm of the activation of grace. So it's not because of some intense suffering that there was a recognition of truth, but because of the grace of truth itself and the cumulative arising of that grace and expressing of that grace as the evolution of conscious awareness, or the conscious experiencing of conscious awareness. So there's a lot that unfolded after that. I don't know how far you want to take it, but that's kind of, up to the seeming transition point of stable, clear field recognition. That wasn't actually the first shift in identity. As I said, there still seemed to be Andrew in place, but at that point, an intense, almost consuming fire for spiritual work began to express itself. So every day was just characterized by this deep devotion and commitment to truth and investigation into the nature of identity and prayer and meditation. And it was almost like, I don't know, it was the most familiar thing. It was quite interesting because it was like I had found, something had found itself, and it was just a naturalness and an ease that was really self-actualizing. There was really no sense of effort. Yet, if someone were perceiving it from a seeming exterior viewpoint, they might feel like, oh, there's a lot of effort going on. But there was no sense of effort. It was that effortless effort that was really fueled by the fire of devotion and this deep love that was flowing in the midst of that presence that was revealing itself. And so in the midst of all of that, some speaking started. It just kind of started arising on its own. It was, it was something that I couldn't not do. I mean, it was just expressing itself spontaneously. And oftentimes, it wasn't the most popular expression, but nonetheless, it just had to come out. So I never decided to speak or teach or anything like that. It just I feel like teaching is one of those things that you can't not do it if it's a part of what's going to unfold. And that certainly has been the case here. So at a certain point, there was a movement from the sense of there being Andrew as the experiencer of this presence of divinity and this recognizable field of divine light, which was also sort of permeating the forms and shining forth through in almost a soft light, a soft transparency coming off of forms and those kinds of things. There was a transitioning from the sense of there being an experiencer to the recognition that that's what I was. So the presence, the field, awakened to itself and realized that it was the omnipresent everywhereness of that alive fullness that had replaced the appearance of space, empty space.
A lot of the times when some of the non-dual speakers talk about this realization or recognition, usually it's kind of like, that is it. Like it has that feel of this is it kind of quality. Would you agree with that? Or do you think this was just the first realization of what unfolded further?
Oh yeah, it was most certainly, it was just really the beginning in a certain sense, yeah. And, there's always a sense of completion, comparatively speaking. There's a sense of finality to a certain degree. There's a sense that something is it. Yeah, that's, there's no doubt that subjectively it can show up in that way, but I had already been exposed to the understanding that there were multiple shifts, and it was kind of an innate, intuitive knowledge as well. I actually, kind of looking back on it, I don't think at that point of the initial shift there had been exposure. Shortly after that, there was, but there was a knowing that there was. That it wasn't the end, and that was soon experientially verified as things continue to unfold. So, okay.
Usually when I bring up this topic, especially among modern non-dual speakers, it seems to get interpreted as though like this is some more activity coming from mind, some more concepts coming from mind. How would you clarify that this is not another trap created by the me story?
Sure. Well, you know, it could equally be said that saying that this is more mind is just more mind. And that itself is kind of like a self-limiting position or definition, hiding behind non-conceptual, this is it, nothing else kind of talk. And there's oftentimes I find that there's like almost a smug sense of superiority contained in that, that like this is it and I see this is it, and if you think there's more than this, then you're deluded, you're crazy or whatever. You're just fooling yourself, and really that's fine. That's totally fine. It's something that is only subjectively verifiable. So I would really only be interested in speaking to those that are interested in, full unfoldment and comprehensive development, not battling ones that say that there isn't. And it's innocent enough, they're coming from their own, non-perspective perspective or whatever, however they would frame that. And I really see that as kind of like a temporary phase for spirituality here in the West. I don't think it'll last. Those teachers, generationally speaking, they'll die off, and and the teachings won't really carry forward because they're not close to the truth. There'll be bits and pieces, and they'll be around, just like all kinds of teachings have been around on this planet, to varying degrees. The ones that we hear about most prominently are the ones that are closest to truth. We hear about those great teachers like Jesus Christ and Buddha and Krishna and the teachings that arose from them. And of course, many other great examples as well. And I think that some of the neo-advaita teachers would even say, there is no Krishna, no Buddha. Those are all, it's all illusion, delusion, whatever. And yeah, I mean, on some level, there is some truth there. It's subjectively, it may seem that way, but I would consider it just a phase and just a temporary stepping stone. So the teachings which tend to survive and thrive are those which are closest to truth. And there's a saying in the Vedic tradition that which is closest to truth survives the longest. And I feel that is the case.
Can you comment a little bit about the phase after the realization? Because when it's seen that you are not the doer, the next thing that comes up is then who is the doer? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If you can describe how that phase unfolded for you, that I think that will be helpful for others who are going through that phase.
Yes, of course. Well, it's important to note here that there's several different styles of the initial shift. And depending on the cultural context and the orientation and the overall conditioning or karma, it's going to be held in a different way, and it's going to, show up with a nuanced presentation subjectively. I could really sort of generalize the initial shift into two main styles. One would be more of a masculine style of shifting, and the other would be more of a feminine style. Now, I qualify that as masculine and feminine, not in reference to male and female within the realm of the human form, but in reference to formless subjectivity, and that is our own conscious awareness. So there's two aspects to conscious awareness. One could be considered masculine and the other feminine. And that's a large part of what is being put forth here in this teaching. So more of a masculine shift is one that has a drier flavor to it. Yeah. It has to do with shifting into that pure, silent, changeless awareness, although it's not necessarily always framed that way. There can be more of a sense of no self or nobody being here. And the emphasis is on what isn't here rather than what is here, at least initially. And sometimes it stays that way, just depending on if we get stuck in a certain conclusion about what is unfolding. So the masculine style shift is a little bit drier, a little bit flatter. It's characterized by peace, deep peace. And the feminine style of shift is one that has more of a richness and a fullness and a devotional sort of sense of transitioning or merging or surrendering or recognizing that oneself is the intelligence that is appearing as form, and that full, alive presence that replaces the appearance of empty space. So in a feminine style shift, it's a little bit more climactic. It seems to kind of build and progress, and then there's a transition. Yeah. And in a masculine style shift, it can tend to be almost like a click, and that can be like the sense of there not being a me, oh, there's no self, or it can be the silent field of pure awareness seeing itself. Yeah. And that is what characterizes a masculine shift. Those are more common. I'm seeing much more feminine style shifts and around this body, at least. And I feel like that's a phenomena that's going to increase as things continue to evolve on a collective level. So in both shifts, there is a recognition of one's identity as, not necessarily always in the masculine side, because that doesn't mean that there's field recognition when you're just seeing that there's no person or that there's no me, there's no separate individual. So in the way that I would characterize initial shift, it has to do with field recognition, field realization. This field of conscious awareness realizes itself in what seems to be a dominance of aspects. In both cases, the sense of doership is severed. Yeah. So the ego itself, the processing centrality of the human ego, does not disappear. Okay. The identification with it is transcended or cut asunder, if you will. And of course, there's remnants and residue and different things that are being processed out on a multiplicity of levels. But that's what characterizes the initial shift, is the seeing of oneself as this silent, vibrant field that is all around right here. And in seeing yourself as this field, you see that you are not the doer, that you are not the actor, that you're not, in a certain sense, you're not sitting down, you're not listening to these words. The sitting down and the listening is an appearance of your own intelligence as this field. So as you said, then the question becomes, well, how is all of this appearing? What's going on here? There's no separate individual that's doing anything. Well, what is doing it? And depending on the degree of refinement and depending on the maturation of the development, that will perhaps show up differently. I think in many masculine cases, what we see is more of an assumption of mechanical kind of conditioning that is just kind of running operative, almost like there's like a robotic nature to the body and mind, and it just will stay that way and you just don't feel like you're inside of it anymore. It's like just a mechanical automaton, or whatever you call those things, automatron or whatever, that's just running, right? And I would say that that's a less refined, less refined recognition. Not that it's not valid, and it does seem to be that way in certain cases. It has a drier, flatter, more mechanical quality, and there's no real insight into how that has developed, other than perhaps even the remaining kind of materialistic view. And we have examples of masculine shifts where a materialistic sort of view is still held. It just is seen in the context of there not being a separate individual inside of the body, which of course that's not the case. We're moving beyond the dominance of physicality and the perception that there is an objective world entirely into the nature of subjectivity itself as this field, this infinite field. So on a more refined side of things, what begins to take place is that the self that you are, this one self that you are, begins to explore its own intelligence. And so it begins to have insights into the way in which its own intelligence is flowing and patterning and shaping itself into the play of experience. And, there's a lot of subtlety and depth there, but generally speaking, the mechanics and the dynamics that are underneath the surface begin to become clear. And it becomes clear as yourself. So it's not that you're exploring something else. It's that the one self that you are is actually exploring itself and realizing these finer values of its own intelligence.
Do you think, like, I've watched some of your content where you have talked about the nuances of differences between emptiness and nothingness. Do you think sometimes what gets discussed in modern non-duality, they confuse emptiness with nothingness?
That's quite an interesting subject, actually. Classically speaking, emptiness is referential to phenomena. So it has to do with recognizing the interdependent origination of all phenomena, and seeing that as a direct insight into the nature of the identitylessness, if you will, of form. What tends to happen nowadays is that, words just are, used and kind of generalized and lumped together, and we end up with sort of a hodgepodge of different language that is taken to all mean the same thing, because after all, there's only one thing, right? There's only one reality, so it's all these things. But it's not really like that. There are different flavors and different qualitative insights and different things that arise in accordance with the path and with the tradition and with the whole karmic background. So nothingness, has we could say two different values. Okay, there's a supreme value of nothingness, and then there's a lesser value of nothingness with a lowercase n, we might say. And this is the nothingness that you typically see spoken in the context of initial masculine shifts. There's no person, there's no anything going on, the things that you think you're doing, you're not, there's nothing happening, that kind of stuff. Yeah. So it's referential to the conceptual level, the mental level. And oftentimes in a masculine shift, what's taking place is there's just a break or a seeing through on the level of the mental configuration of egoity, or the egoic dominance. And so it actually has it translated into the neurophysiology fully. It's more of a mental clarity, if you will. And it's not that you're thinking that. Even in an authentic masculine shift, the sense of a self-concept has been severed, and the sense of there being sort of a me that's associated with the mind is undone to a certain degree. And of course, there's a lot of variation there. And there are, cases where someone kind of fools themselves into thinking that they're awakened, or, you know, that they understand non-duality, or that they've penetrated into this insight, or that they, you know, through thinking that they're not a person, that they're not a person, or whatever kind of weird stuff goes on out there. So the supreme value of nothingness is actually a pretty advanced condition, we might say, and it also has degrees of refinement or degrees of depth, depending on the case. You know, one of the things that can take place more often than not these days is that there's a moving through the masculine shifts. You know, the more masculinely oriented qualitative shifts in infinity. That would be like pure awareness. And then there's one that I call source awareness, which is kind of where the no-thingness and the awareness is recognized simultaneously. Yeah, so there seems to be, in conscious awareness, there seems to be an equilibrium. Sometimes the feminine aspect is negated or rendered insubstantial, it depends. And then in the highest value of nothingness, the self, awareness itself, can seem to disappear, or it's rendered vacant of some substantiality. It doesn't actually disappear. It just seems that it is sort of wiped out in a certain sense. Yeah. And that nothingness is an exquisite, silent infinitude, which I refer to as the void, although it doesn't have any spatial delineation. It's non-spatial void, or supreme nothingness. And it has a supreme total nature to it. David Buckland calls that Brahman, and his lineage refers to that as Brahman. We're talking about the same thing. So it depends on the case. You know, when it comes to modern non-duality, there's a lot of variation out there as far as where someone's coming from, and what it is that they're pointing to, or you know, where they're speaking from. So it would have to be case by case basis. I wouldn't say that they're all coming from supreme nothingness. It doesn't appear that way here.
Yeah, it becomes very tricky to interview in some cases, because even if someone tries to point to the awareness or the field recognition, it gets immediately it gets negated as a story of it turns into a word game. That's why it's very difficult to interview.
Yeah, I can imagine. You have a lot of courage, you know. I don't think I could do it. Some of them are really funny, you know, because it's just like, wow, it doesn't really matter what you say, because the whole sort of it's like you said, it's like a game. It's this kind of weird negation game, and you could repeat back what they're saying, and they'll say, no, that's not, no, that's not. You know, no, that's not, see, that's too much, you know, whatever. And that's kind of that's where, and I can see what's going on there, you know, and I'm sure not all of them are asleep to what's going on. Maybe they're playing, you know, in a certain sense, I think sometimes, but I don't find it to be the most beneficial, and mistaking it to be some sort of, you know, condition, or they wouldn't even say that, you know, or some sort of no condition, you know, nothing's, you know, whatever, is a self-limitation. You know, it's a self-limitation, not for an individual, but for the self. You know, there's only one self, and that's this field of conscious awareness itself.
And also there is the other extreme of that. Nothingness is where the other extreme is where it becomes all about the practice. It becomes all about like, I have to get there, and I can do all these things. I can meditate for hours and get to this point. That's the other extreme that takes place.
Yes, exactly. And I think that on some level, those teachings sort of were designed to undercut that other extreme, because you have a lot of seekers that were really burnt out and tired and discouraged and frustrated, and something hadn't been realized, and they've been doing this for this many years or whatever. And in certain cases, they come along to one of these neo-advaita teachers, and it's like, just totally undermines everything that the what I would refer to as the spiritual ego complex had sort of invested in. And in those cases, sometimes there is a insight, and it's like this great sense of relief, or at least there's this belief that, oh, all this seeking is pointless. There's nothing to seek for and no one to seek. And so then there's this kind of false sense of, oh yeah, this false sense of arrival, this false sense of having found out that there's nothing to do and nowhere to go and no one to do anything, and all of these different things. And it's kind of in a way, I don't want to say it's sad, but it's you can see the innocence of it, almost like children. We are on the level of our humanity oftentimes like children, just trying to find some sense of, just like I was talking about at the beginning, trying to find that sense of completion and wholeness and satisfaction.
Yeah, I think there are two sides to this, where the feminine side approach towards the realization, there is a chances that it can create a spiritual ego, whereas the masculine can, now I'm noticing that it can create a lot of no me concepts. Although like there would be like dismissing everything.
Yes. And that actually could be seen as a form of the spiritual ego. So the spiritual ego then is a no person, is nobody, and that's the new identity. So you move from being somebody to nobody, and of course, if you're nobody, then everybody that thinks they're somebody is stupid, and they don't see that they're nobody, or whatever kind of, those kinds of things. And I mean, the subtlety of it is definitely there, and it can be easy to get stuck in those kinds of assumptions. And then on the other side, as you said, with the feminine, if it's out of balance in either side, there's the tendency for limitation. So what we're really talking about is a balanced, unified, comprehensive unfoldment, where the masculine and the feminine are sort of equally expressed and revealed and present within the expression of truth.
Can you share a little bit more about the refinement of perception after the realization? Because especially for the approach that you mentioned about where the realization feels like a click, sometimes it happens at the mind level, it can take some time for it to kind of pierce through the whole being in a way, because there's a difference, like although that seeing happens, there can be a long period of time where that identification completely drops off, even at the body level. Can you share more about that phase, about how that those refinements that happen after realization?
Sure. Well, of course, it depends on the case and the context, and whether someone is set up in a certain methodology, they have a certain sort of toolkit in place, if you will, and things are running on their own, or if they are kind of in that space where they're just negating any kind of seeming movement or anything that could possibly be perceived as effort. So in the case of someone that does have some kind of practice that is in place, the masculine shift has the tendency, let's say in a meditation practice, the tendency to find some balance. Of course, that really has to do oftentimes with the with the karmic context and what we could consider to be like the soul history, if you will. I don't often use that term, and I think that it's important that we understand when I say soul, I'm just referring to the sort of individuated point value of infinity, which also is infinitely a point in a certain sense. And it's not a new age kind of concept or anything. So there's certain tendencies and proclivities and likelihoods that are present within the realm of refinement. And, there's going to be a lot of variation. Some of us are going to taste more, what seems to be more refinement, or it's going to be a different kind of refinement, and all of that kind of stuff. In the cases where there's been a masculine shift and the whole concept of refinement seems really abstract and kind of pointless or, inaccessible, I find that it's beneficial to be in a certain energy field. So if there's a teaching available that teaches, speaks to stages beyond the initial shift, then if someone is drawn to refinement, then they'll most certainly be drawn to, the possibility of such a teaching, and being in an energy field, an environment which cultivates or supports the cultivation of those deeper, fuller, richer recognitions. At the same time, one of the main things that I focus on is devotion. And anyone that comes here surrounding refinement, of course, I'm going to bring up devotion and point them towards the possibility of devotion, not as a doing, not as something that you add to your basket of tricks, to get somewhere, but as a way of being which really characterizes the continuation of the human incarnation. And it's a devotion to truth. It's a devotion to the reality of divinity as the infinite love and the infinite source and essence that is shining as conscious awareness itself. And in that, what's really taking place is that divinity is devoted to itself, we could say. Its expression in the human form has become the vehicle for its turning towards its reality and surrendering in. And so even on the level of those recognitions of our infinity, whether they be masculine or feminine, we're going to be called to surrender even that sense of being everything, that sense of being this infinite awareness. And indeed, you are that infinite awareness, but you can surrender that self, that infinite awareness. It can surrender itself into that which is beyond awareness. And even that beyondness can then be surrendered in a certain sense. So what I feel is most appropriate is the path of surrender and the emphasis on surrender. And I tend to really call for the potential of the heart and the potential of love and commitment to be activated. And there's different ways in which that can be approached. But one of the main threads through which devotion can express itself or commitment can express itself is the thread of resolution. And this is a main aspect or facet of what's being put forward here. And it has to do with resolving unresolved baggage or unresolved layers of impressions and egoic sediment and residue, and all of that material that is associated with the ignorance of conscious awareness within itself, everything that has been accumulated through that misperception within this infinite field that seemed to show up as this sense of being only a body and a mind and only a small little individual entity. So all of that material is still there, even in cases where they feel like, oh, there's nothing there, and anything that has to do with the person is just not true and not there, and I don't believe it, and there's nothing to there's nothing to not believe or whatever. I would say it's still there. It's just unconscious. It's not being addressed because the condition itself provides a certain blind spot, inability to recognize and own. Everything that seems to be associated with the past of the person or whatever is recognized to be impersonal. As conscious awareness realizes itself, wakes up to itself, is situated within its own infinity, then our memories don't disappear. They're still there, but we see that the whole time we've been an infinite field, that, the seeming lifetime of the body has really sort of been projected to have unfolded within our own timeless light. And that bank of impressions and that bank of residue is still present, to varying degrees and with, some seeming uniqueness. But generally speaking, the uniqueness is just a mixture of that which is general and sort of referential to the human condition. So we're not as unique as we thought we were, and we come to find that out. And when we're willing to see that material, to own it, to look at the unconscious aspects of experience and the darkness, then we'll begin to witness refinement come online in a new way. So a large part of a comprehensive pathway includes identifying and observing and owning and resolving and healing, attentively allowing darkness and material that's based in darkness, and of course just what you might consider to be general sediment of the illusion of separation.
And it seems like a lot of the older unprocessed information or blind spots may get processed faster because those constraints of ego have fallen off. So it may be faster to process them.
Yeah, of course, that's a great point. Yes, when a lot of that material is actually being held down by the identification with the egoic centrality. And so what's accessible in egoic dominance is limited. I really look at it in two different sort of phases or packages, as if you will. There's, egoic dominance, identifiable material, and then there's material that's only identifiable from the status of infinity. So when infinity is awake to itself, is clear about itself as this field right here, then that does open up that space, quote unquote, which allows for the purification to translate into a much deeper field of arising.
And this is a very difficult question, Andrew, but I think you would be able to answer it. What unfolds after all that? Let's say that that cleaning up has happened and those refinements have, or purification has happened. What unfolds further in this process?
Well, there's a lot of depth. There's infinite depth here in this, we go through different stages and different seasons where things feel to be more or less complete and resolved and so on and so forth. And then opportunity arises for a more fundamental or essential recognition of reality within itself. And with that, typically, we're going to witness new waves of purification and new waves of surfacing and new things to be seen and held and allowed and resolved. And more that translates into collective material. Yeah. So it kind of, we, more or less work through what seems to be the individuated package, at least as a sort of substantial flow of content. And then that kind of opens up into the possibility of different layers of residue that are referential to humanity as a whole surfacing. Now, in that case, when those layers are surfacing, it's going to utilize the impressions that are associated with an individual body and mind. And so but at that point, because there is a clarity about the reality of I, what I truly is, it's not, it's less sticky, and there's a recognition of how that collective material is sort of being brought to the surface through what appears to be the sensory environment associated with a given body and mind, or perhaps residual sensory impressions that were associated with this body and mind, so on and so forth. Not that there still isn't, things that are there that have more of an individuated presence to them as far as, different unresolved material, but that generally speaking, it is lessened, depending on the stage. I'm speaking more about like post-conscious awareness development, which would be supreme nothingness and pure divinity. I've found that, like right now, I do not consider anything to be done here, and I'm very, 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 very open for things to continue to unfold and continue to reveal greater depth, and on a daily basis, I feel that that's taking place. So it's really quite amazing, how much opportunity is present in this human body, and what a gift it is. And it's our degree of willingness to be with that, and not to say, oh, this is where I am and this is where I'll be, or whatever kind of stuff like that. Yeah.
Another thing I really liked about some of your insights was you made, like, you were able to explain some of the nuances of how reality emerges from because especially for me, because with some of the non-dual speakers, they don't talk about consciousness. It's not recognized. But you were able to talk about like how it emerges out of consciousness, and the some of the nuances about that. If you can share that, I think some viewers may find that insightful.
Sure. Yeah, I can go over that a little bit. One more note I'll make on our previous discussion, is that even though we recognize our reality to be complete, and we are completion itself, there still seems to be a process going on the level of appearances. It's an apparent process. We don't mistake it for being anything other than the appearances within the completion that I always is. So it's complete yet in process yet complete. And that's a very, very important note when it comes to the refinement and the willingness and just the simple openness that receives the continuation of grace, as it expresses itself in alignment with the whole. So you would like for me just to kind of talk about how creation is appearing on some level? Is that, yeah? Okay. Well, we all have sort of different cognitive faculties that come online in the process, we might say, and it each one of us is a unique perspective, and we're able to sort of offer a unique perspective and hold a unique perspective. So David has much more refinement in certain areas than I do, and then we have another friend, Dorothy Rowe, who also has a lot of sort of a different level of refinement. And there's just we all kind of are. It's divinity exploring itself within its own mind, if you will, non-volitionally. Divinity's not doing anything. It's just kind of by its very nature. And the mind, the light of divinity, is a self-exploring sort of continuum of that intelligence. So we start with the recognition of pure divinity as the fundamental reality of I. Because pure divinity is descriptively infinite power, infinite love, infinite glory, infinite sacredness. And this infinite divinity, in a whim to know itself as many, in a musing to appear as many, we could say, there is what I refer to as the primary withdrawal, or the primary appearance of absence. And that's where that, in a sense, a certain flash of nothingness first arises. And in that nothingness or no thingness, that qualityless totality is inert, inactive awareness. That inert, inactive awareness is activated in a simultaneity of this whim, of this impulse, by this conscious aliveness or conscious presence. And so in that activation, what we see then is the emergence of the self in a way as a reverberation within the void, as a reverberation within the qualityless, no thingness. Yeah. And that timeless reverberation is what I refer to as the primary distinction. And that's the distinction between conscious presence, this full, vibrant, conscious aliveness, this feminine aspect, and the pure, silent, changeless awareness of this still seeing. That's the masculine aspect. And this primary distinction is also a primary tension, yeah, or a primary vibration. We could look at it as a primary sound as well. One of the ways that I like to frame it is through what I call the tension threshold collapse function. So there's this primary tension, which is this conscious presence purely aware of itself, and this pure awareness consciously present to itself. And that tension then collapses into an infinite number of threshold points, which I'll refer to as secondary tensions. And these secondary tensions then collapse into unique vibratory patternings, unique vibratory distinctions of the primary vibration, which are also an expression of tension threshold collapse, but in a unique, nuanced way, as guided by a centralized intelligence known as egoity. So in that activation of the silent, changeless, inactive awareness, so that it is alive to itself, knowing itself, conscious of itself. In that primary distinction, there's also a centralization principle that emerges, we could say. And the centralization principle is basically where the infinite horizontal nature of the feminine fullness sort of meets the infinitely vertical, dimensionless awareness. So it's almost like the cross section of the feminine and the masculine is a centralization principle. And that centralization principle guides the tension threshold collapse function, which is also a self-experiencing flow. We look at it as tension threshold collapse, and that seems a little bit more tut. But when that tut is sped up, it's a fluid, you see? So it's almost like on the film reel, yeah? We can look at this film, this piece of film, this piece of film, this piece of film. But if we run the film in a smoothness, then it has a continuity. It has a flow, yeah? And so that's the self-experiencing of the self within itself, conscious awareness within itself, tension threshold collapse, as guided by the centralization principle of egoity. And that basically is the individuation, progressive individuation of conscious awareness within itself. And in those secondary pockets of tension that are collapsing into the unique, nuanced vibratory distinctions, that centralization expresses as different laws of nature or different guiding centralities, different guiding aspects of divine intelligence. Yeah. And then that translates into the shaping of a given multiverse structure. Multiverse is multiple universes. Yeah. And then, of course, there's a lot of detail in there that maybe David would be able to fill you in on a little bit more. I tend to sort of just jump ahead at that point and look at how that centrality basically progressively individuates into through this universe into a galaxy and then into a planetary system, solar system, planetary system, a planet Earth, all of it is guided, all of the expression of that vibratory tension is being shaped and molded in a way through the power, the driving power of that activation of pure divinity. So everything is basically an expression of the power of God, if you will. I'm not afraid to say God. That is kind of driving that whole process of the individuation of conscious experiencing and its formation as the perceptual configuration of creation. So within that secondary pocket, that secondary tension and the multiverse structure, we see, unique universes that are also expressions of this tension, threshold, collapse, tension, threshold, collapse, tension, threshold, collapse, which when sped up is a flow of conscious experiencing. That flow is being shaped and molded through the centralized guiding principles of egoity, which are basically conscious awareness in action, sort of in that self-interacting flow. And that, shapes itself into all of the subtleties of the universe with its planets and stars and galaxies. And when we look at the universe, we see centrality everywhere. When we look at a planet, when we look at a solar system, we look at a universe, the universe on some levels has a certain centrality, you might say, which isn't fixed or sort of set, but in a constant seemingness of evolution and expansion. And then that centralized formation, this is another important point, is that what that self-experiencing, the pure awareness consciously present to itself and the conscious presence purely aware of itself shows up as an impregnation of the potentiality of the feminine. So we might say that the perceptually actualizing gaze of pure awareness impregnates the feminine potential of conscious presence. And that's the stillness that's impregnating the aliveness, through the contrast. And that shows up as an objectification. So we could look at the basic unfoldment as a certain objectification of supreme subjectivity and semi-subjectification of supreme subjectivity, so that the infinite subject, the infinite self, appears to individuate itself and interact with itself and objectify itself. So that objectification is what is sort of flowing as the patterning of potentiality into the specificity of the sort of elemental order and its configuration and the emergence of a given planetary sphere. And then, of course, on planet Earth, we see that elementary sort of order, the principles, the principles of elemental consciousness are configured and formed and shaped through that spontaneous power and that driving power of divinity. And that progressively expresses itself as what shows up as the organisms of intelligent life on planet Earth. And those organisms then appear to have a hierarchical complexity, and there's subtle hierarchies contained within that surrounding different levels of creation that are less pronounced or sort of gross, physically discernible. And all of that fits together intimately and perfectly. But I tend to just sort of focus in on how the conscious experiencing evolves through what seems to be a complexification of processing on this planetary system. And in that complexification of processing, what takes place in the human being is that the processing centrality becomes a dominant conclusion of subjectivity, so that conscious awareness concludes that I is this processing system, which basically is referential to the body. So the body being a product or an expression of the self-experiencing flow of tension, threshold, collapse. is guided by that centrality. And within that supreme centrality guiding, there's a sub-centrality of egoity, yeah, and or a sub-centrality of what we could call the human ego. So it's like a processing system that develops, and that processing system then appears to become a dominant sense of self, and that shows up as the illusion of separation, the sense of fragmentation from life, so on and so forth.
So if I understand correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong. So for example, if there is a story of feminine getting oppressed, it shows up at different levels of creation. That pattern will show up at many different levels. Is that
okay? So you're saying if there's a story of women being oppressed, then the residue of that will be present at different levels of creation. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. Or not as a gender thing like women, but just the feminine energy getting oppressed. Would that story get reverb, like the vibration of that story shows up in different levels of creation?
We could, it's interesting. We could look at it as the feminine aspect is what seems to sort of conceal itself, and the masculine follows that concealment, you might say, so that, because the awareness and conscious presence are inseparable. They're not two, they're non-dual. They're distinct, but they're inseparable. And, the feminine has been compared to what they would call the Maya Shakti, or the sort of measurable potency of divinity that sort of actualizes as all of this measurement and all of this perceived material. And then Shiva, or awareness, follows that, pure awareness follows that. And I think that's a beautiful perspective. And it is like that. And one of the most helpful understandings is the understanding of Leela, or the understanding of it being a game or a play of divinity. So it's not so much that the feminine is oppressed, but it's that it's concealed, that the feminine is concealed. And that depends on the, what they could, you could refer to as the cycles of time, or yugas in the Vedic culture, just the different collective, periods of evolution. In the denser period, which is often called the Kali Yuga, it's well understood that the feminine is sort of concealed to a greater degree, and there's more of a masculine approach, renunciation, negation, those kinds of things. So I don't know if that answers your question, but in our current context, the feminine is sort of coming more into the foreground. That has to do with healing and resolving and allowing and surrender and those kinds of things. Not that it wasn't present, in past centuries, because it was, and there was also there's balanced perspectives that are found in different philosophies. But that generally speaking, there was a sort of the masculine approach was the safer, more stable way, when there was so much prevalence of ignorance and confusion and seeming temptation and a lack of connection. And so the world was often sort of put down as a cesspool, something to be sort of gotten rid of and gone away from, and that varies according to the tradition, but it's a prominent thread, I would say, in certain cultures. So it's acknowledgeable. Yeah.
I think we covered a nice flow, like self-realization stages of enlightenment, and then also the emergence of creation. So I was wondering, do you think we missed, is there anything you'd like to cover today, or do you think this was a good kind of introduction for someone who is interested in this topic?
Yeah, no, I think we covered quite a bit. yeah, I always just like to bring it back to devotion, you know, and the willingness to give everything to the truth and to discover what's always here, what's nearer than near, you know, what the heart truly longs for, and yeah, to be flexible and open. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share a little bit. Thank you for having me on.
Is that, before we wrap up, is that the approach that you take with some of your courses?
Yes, and in the programs we offer, you know, they vary quite a bit. Some of them are more on the masculine side, some of them are more on the feminine side. Some of them have to do with the unification of both, and I think overall it's pretty well balanced. But generally speaking, you know, the emphasis on devotion and the sweetness of devotion itself is something that I tend to focus on, because, you know, after having sort of, you know, passed through different stages and different modalities of infinity, and been graced with the opportunity to witness this kind of perpetual flow of resolution, what has become ever more clear here as far as the essence of what is, you know, truly valuable and truly sweet. It is that devotion itself, you know, commitment itself, willingness itself is a profound display of divine truth. And this isn't about getting somewhere. It's not about being, you know, seen as spiritual. It's not about being able to say that we've had this insight or that there's no person here or any of that kind of stuff. It just isn't about that, you know. And for us to embrace the maturity of human life is to just see that these things, you know, that are referential to the spiritual ego are so unimportant. And we have the opportunity to taste the sweetness of willingness together and commitment, and the love of the divinity that I always is. So that's what I hope most of our material is centered in.
That's a beautiful message, Andrew. I'm really glad I got this opportunity to talk to you. I think you bring in a very fresh perspective on this subject. So thank you. If people want to find out more about you, non-dual-devotion.com is your website.
That's right. Yeah, non-dual-devotion.com. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
And thanks to the listeners.
Yeah, thank you guys.